I'm Thomas Hall, Executive Director of CleanStart, and I would like to welcome Daniel Mazzone, who's a PhD candidate at UC Davis in the Agriculture and Resource Economics College.
Thanks, Thomas. I know my department name can be a mouthful sometimes. I have trouble saying it as well. It's a tough one. Hello, everyone. Thomas, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. As Thomas said, my name is Daniel Mazzone. I am a PhD candidate at UC Davis, and I've been studying low carbon fuel policies for the past 3 or 4 years now. And today I'm going to talk about what's going on with them and give you some insight into how they work and things like that. So I am a trained economist. I have a bachelor's in economics, a master's in economics, and now a PhD basically in economics. But I grew up in Maryland and grew up on the water at Chesapeake Bay, and that's what really got me into environmental issues, seeing what's happening with the bay, and my love for nature. So that kind of drove me to, use my tools in economics to address environmental issues. And I think a really important one is what's going on in the transportation sector, and these low carbon fuel policies are targeted in the transportation sector. So with that, I will get started and I'll share my screen. So as I said, I'm going to be talking about low carbon fuel policies. There are several names for them. They're called different things in different places. The most common term is a low carbon fuel standard. Probably also heard it as a clean fuel standard. This is different though from Biden's new proposal for a clean energy standard, or I'm sorry, electricity standard. These are more broad policies. So basically how they work is the administrating agency sets a target for the life cycle carbon intensity that they want the transportation sector to reach. And this target determines, or fuels are evaluated against this target with the life cycle carbon intensity that they're scored. So for instance, reference fuels such as gasoline or diesel, petroleum, will typically come in above the standard, and that will generate them deficits that must be met with credits. So here you see, how far above the CI target a fuel's carbon intensity is, the more deficits it will accrue. And then there are the alternative fuels, and alternative fuels will have a lower carbon intensity generally. And so for instance, you could have a fuel like alternative fuel X here that comes in right at the target. And in a case like that, nothing really happens. You're in compliance perfectly. But then there are other alternative fuels with much lower CIs than the target, and those will generate credits. Again, depending on how far below the standard it is, the more credits it will generate. And then, so how is this life cycle carbon intensity determined? Well, it takes into account the entire life cycle, and that means from wherever the first thing that happens for creating this fuel, whatever emissions come along with that, that's captured, and then all the way through the supply chain, and all the way until the fuel is burned and coming out of the tailpipe. So on the left here, in the case of ethanol, it starts at the farm. So most of the ethanol that we see in California and in the US is from corn. So whatever emissions are associated with getting that corn, and from there, transportation, biorefining, and then finally the emissions associated with the vehicle itself. On top of that, it accounts for things like land use change. So for instance, there's people are interested in the fact that biofuels policy may be driving the demand for alternative fuels, may be leading farmers to plant more corn for biofuels. And if there's any indirect land use change, that's accounted for in the carbon intensity. And then for something like electricity, it depends on which sources of generation we're using, transmission, and things like that. So for each fuel, there are different life cycles depending on how they work. And each alternative fuel producer must demonstrate their life cycle, have it verified, and then a CI is determined for them using a model. In California, that model is called GREET, G-R-E-E-T. And so an LCFS is a market-based policy. It allows the market to determine the fuel mix used to meet the mandate, but only to an extent. And this feature is known as technological neutrality. So basically, the LCFS is agnostic to what technology is being used, which fuels are being used. It only cares about how much we're lowering the carbon intensity. However, I say to an extent because it still chooses the universe of fuels that you're allowed to use at a given time, and it does favor electric vehicles in a way that takes you a little away from technological neutrality. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But generally, it's, it allows the market to use the lowest cost method to meet the standard, whatever that may be. So regulated entities under this, so these are mostly refiners and fuel importers. And these are normally the people producing gasoline and diesel, have two choices. They can either reduce the CI of their fuel to meet the standard, or they can purchase credits from alternative fuel producers who are generating them with their low carbon fuels. In practice, it turns out to be pretty difficult to lower the CI of gasoline and diesel. Gasoline is gasoline. There are methods you can take to kind of bring it down incrementally, but most of the time it's alternative fuel producers supplying their alternative fuels and regulated entities purchasing credits from them. And system-wide compliance for this policy is met just if we have more credits than deficits. That's the idea. And so how this goes out in practice, how this plays out in practice is that these deficits that accrue to the regulated entities act as an implicit tax on supplying their fuels. This is because since they have to retire their deficits, they have to purchase credits to match them. That purchasing of credits is basically a tax, right? They have to pay an additional cost to supplying their fuel for each unit of gasoline or diesel that they supply. And similarly, the credits act as an implicit subsidy going to alternative fuel producers. And so what this does is it bridges the gap between the higher costs of alternative fuels and the lower cost of gasoline and diesel by putting a tax on the gasoline and diesel and putting a subsidy on the alternative fuels, making them cost competitive, and basically making a fuel blender indifferent between purchasing alternative fuels and petroleum fuels in the case of the liquid market. And a very important piece is that these credits can be freely banked across years. And what this entails is that we can generate credits in the beginning and when the standard is lax, right? So since the standard decreases over time, it's easier to generate credits today as opposed to tomorrow. So that helps. That helps, and it helps with stimulating investment in these technologies. And it also is good because carbon reductions today are better than carbon reductions tomorrow. So those are the basics of how these policies work. And now I'm going to kind of get into what's happening in practice a little bit. So there are 3 currently operating low carbon fuel standards. Those are in California, British Columbia, and Oregon. I need to move this. And they each have their own target, carbon intensity reduction target. Most of them are set out to 2030. And both California and British Columbia aim to have a 20% reduction in their carbon intensity by 2030. Oregon is 20% by 2030, and also they've established that they want to reduce their carbon intensity by 25% by 2035. Washington and Canada both are in the the development phase of implementing their low carbon fuel standards, and also New Mexico is just, I think, decided that they're going to start developing one. In addition to that, there's been talk of implementing a low carbon fuel standard at the federal level as well. So now I'm going to talk about what's going on a little bit with the 3 operating ones. So that's California, British Columbia, and Oregon again. So the first thing to note is that California is much bigger than the other 2. And that's really important because scale is important in alternative fuels, right? So California in 2019 had about a little over 18 billion gasoline gallon equivalents worth of fuel energy that were covered under the program. Oregon and British Columbia were much lower, around 2 billion. Another thing to notice is that California is much more gasoline intensive than the other 2 relative to diesel. And that also becomes an important feature, which we'll see in a minute. And since the implementation of each of these standards, we've seen alternative fuel, the percentage of alternative fuel increase in each jurisdiction. In California, most drastically, it's now 12% of all transportation fuel energy is from an alternative source. So how have they been performing under these standards? So all 3 programs have been in compliance up to date, and they have, for the most part, reduced their carbon intensity enough each year to meet the target. Now, compliance doesn't have, so for instance, here when you see British Columbia, this yellow line tells you how close to compliance they are. So if they were meeting the standard each year, that yellow line would be right on that dotted black line. It would be right on the target. Now, in California and British Columbia, in recent years, that yellow line has gone above the black line, which means that the carbon intensity reduction hasn't been enough to meet the target. However, they are still in compliance because in these recent years, we've been drawing down the bank and retiring credits from our bank to meet compliance. So, and the most important thing from this figure is the difference between the blue and the orange line. The diesel sector has driven compliance in each of these programs to date. And this is because of limited opportunities for CI reductions in the gasoline pool. And this is mostly because of the E10 blend wall and fairly slow pace of EV penetration. Now, this fact that most of the CI reductions are coming from the diesel sector kind of implies that there's this large amount of value being transferred from the gasoline sector to the diesel sector, and that is an important fact that I'll come back to later. So the credit markets themselves, prices have risen as the standards have tightened in each jurisdiction. In 2020, prices dropped a little bit in British Columbia and Oregon due to COVID. California did not really take a hit. And part of that is California has been, right at its price ceiling of $200 per metric ton, indexed to 2016 dollars. So in California and Oregon, there are cost containment mechanisms which effectively set a price ceiling in each credit market. British Columbia does not have one. And California has, in recent years, been very close to reaching the price ceiling. And that basically suggests that the market expects compliance to be fairly difficult out to 2030. And one thing to keep in mind that's really important is what do these credit prices mean and what do they reflect? And in the case of an LCFS, the credit price reflects the expected marginal cost of supplying that last gallon of the marginal compliance fuel. It's a lot of words, but basically there are a lot of credit generating opportunities, such as renewable natural gas, electricity, cellulosic ethanol, and things like this, but they tend to be pretty capacity constrained. And what we've learned is that and what you've seen from the previous figure, that compliance is coming from the diesel sector, the marginal compliance fuel is pretty certainly renewable diesel, which will be an important thing that I come to in a minute. And so these credit prices really reflect the expected marginal cost of bringing in enough biomass-based diesel to meet the standard out to 2030. Now, it's hard to go into all three jurisdictions in a short talk. There's a lot going on. So I'm going to focus on California. And if you want to learn more about British Columbia and Oregon, you can read our paper that compares the three. So the interesting part about the LCFS is that it's a CI mandate, and what that means is that fuels generate credits based on how low their CI is. And so you can have a little bit of energy generating a lot of credits if it has a very low CI score. So what you see on the left is total fuel energy by fuel type, and you notice that the vast majority of fuel energy is still gasoline and diesel, and you see a little bit of ethanol and biomass-based diesel at the bottom there, and a tiny bit of biogas, and electricity is almost impossible to see, right? And then on the right, you see something quite different. You see a lot of credits coming from ethanol and biomass-based diesel, quite a bit from biogas and electricity as well. And how big the difference is between the left figure and the right figure is basically according to the carbon intensity, right? So electricity is the best example. You can barely see how much energy is there, but it has a large contribution to compliance. So the first interesting piece that's been going on, I think, is biogas. So now in California, nearly all natural gas for transportation is biogas. Another term for biogas is renewable natural gas, RNG. So from 2012 to now, landfill gas has basically driven fossil natural gas out of the market. And in recent years, starting in about 2018, biogas from dairy digesters has really taken off. And as you can see from the top right figure, dairy digesters earn a very hefty subsidy from the LCFS, about $10 per diesel gallon equivalent. As opposed to its counterpart landfill gas, which comes in around $1.50 or something like that. This massive difference in value going to biogas or to dairy digesters as opposed to these other sources comes from its extremely low CI, and on average is about -200, but some pathways are up to -700 and even more carbon intensity. So this has become a pretty hot topic for this reason. And my professor, Aaron Smith, wrote a great article about this and put it in terms of cows. And what we learned is that so a cost of operating a dairy digester is about $294 per year per cow. And this massive LCFS subsidy turns out to be about $2,000 per year per cow. And so it much more than covers the cost of operating and maintaining a dairy digester. And on top of that, $2,000, this 1935 figure is about half of the value of a cow's milk on average. So it's quite a lot of value. And this leads to the question, do we start getting more cows because of how valuable they are, just so we can capture their gas, right? And I think this is going to be an important question moving forward. And as you see on the left figure, in California, dairy digesters have been kind of rapidly being installed. The reason for all the digesters previously were from the Farm Bill that went from 2006 to 2013, and now basically all new dairy digesters are in California. The other, and I would argue that the most significant and interesting piece of the low carbon fuel standard is now renewable diesel, something that I never heard of a few years ago. Most people probably haven't heard of, but it is the reason that we're complying with all of these policies, and it's going to be the future of, it's going to be the reason we comply with all of these policies in the future. It has been by far the largest credit generator in all three programs, at least in recent years. And in the first quarter of 2021, renewable diesel made up 22% of finished diesel. And renewable diesel is something that is one of the forms of biomass-based diesel, the other being biodiesel. Biodiesel is a little more, I think, well-known because it's had success in the Midwest and the rest of the country for a while under federal policies. But renewable diesel is different because it is what's known as a drop-in fuel. It it can be seamlessly blended with petroleum diesel, and it is chemically equivalent to petroleum diesel in an engine. So whereas biodiesel is not. Biodiesel, there are kind of similar to ethanol, and why we can only have 10% of it in our cars. There are reasons why the biodiesel can only be a certain amount of the blend without ruining engines. So for that reason, those kind of restraints really make it important for renewable diesel to scale to help comply with this policy. And renewable diesel gets a ton of money from this policy. And not just from this policy, but from overlapping policies. So 1 gallon of renewable diesel generates nearly $5 in combined incentives in California. $1 of that comes from the blender's tax credit. $2 comes from the renewable fuel standard. So which are, their credits are called RINs, renewable identification numbers. And then another $2 from LCFS credits. And recently we see renewable diesel costs about like $7 a gallon. So covers quite a bit of the cost. And in 2020, about $1 billion was worth of credit value was generated in California for RD. RD can be produced from vegetable oils, waste greases, and animal fats. And when we talk about waste greases, the big one is used cooking oil. So it's literally cooking oil that's used in restaurants after making food. We can go collect that that oil and use it as fuel. And that's been the big story in this space. And this other category is soybean oil, which is also starting to pick up. Now, UCO and tallow have the lowest CI of all the renewable diesel feedstocks, but they are fairly constrained on capacity. So renewable diesel is, like I said, likely to be the future of this policy, in my opinion. And it's not just in California, but in the US, it's really kind of taking off. According to the EIA here, there is plans for capacity to reach 6 billion gallons in 2024. And a lot of this capacity is actually coming from these large companies such as Exxon, Valero, Phillips 66, retrofitting their refineries to enable large scale renewable diesel production. And to produce renewable diesel, actually, you can take a refinery that's already operational and basically add a hydro treater to it and take some hydrogen and take the oxygen out of that fuel, and then basically the rest of the infrastructure kind of works to produce that fuel. So for that reason, it's been a really popular way for these big refineries to kind of meet their net zero targets and things like this. And however, this crazy amount of capacity that's coming online, or that's supposed to come online, is bringing some concern to the market. There is used cooking oil and animal fats are pretty constrained. You can't. I mean, cooking oil, you can only collect how much based on how much people are eating, right? We're not going to make restaurants start making food and throwing it in the trash just so we can collect their oil. There's only so much to be done. And what this means is that we're going to have to use a lot more soybean oil is basically the case. And that leads to these land use changes that aren't good, and that also leads to increased crop prices, perhaps if these volumes get large enough. So that's been a pretty big concern, as well as the fact that you need a lot of hydrogen to produce a lot of renewable diesel, and that has local pollution kind of consequences that environmental groups are starting to worry about. The last big piece here is electricity, and electricity, I think, is the fun and kind of nuanced one here. Electricity generates LCFS credits because it is technically a fuel. Half are from on-road sources, and half of the credits generated are from off-road sources. So off-road sources are things like light rail, electric forklifts, ocean-going vessels, and things like these. On-road sources are the electric vehicles that we drive, and if there's electric buses, electric, as we start getting into more heavy-duty electric things. So in terms of light duty, so cars that just basic electric vehicles, charging for those comes the majority from home. So 85% of EV charging is residential in California. And LCFS credits for this residential charging go to the utility, not the fuel producer, which is different than how the LCFS works for every other fuel. And with this money, utilities use it mostly to promote point of purchase programs, so to directly lower the cost of purchasing electric vehicles, which is also something that does not happen with any other fuel. And this is where, going back in the beginning when I mentioned that the LCFS is technologically neutral to an extent, this is the idea, is that we are doing something fundamentally different with electricity than we do with all other fuels under the program. And we're basically picking that as the future winner in this space, right? And the value going to light duty charging has been quite substantial. In 2020, electric charging earned 20 cents per kilowatt hour in California. And that is 3 cents more than the retail price of electricity in California. So it's quite substantial. And now there are these new booking claim accounting methods where, there are these contracts for low CI electricity, even outside the state, and a lot of low CI pathways. So the LCFS allows you, if you can meter your electricity, you can earn, and you can show it's coming from clean sources, you can earn a lower CI. And most of these are actually earn a 0 CI. So if you can show that you're using solar or wind or something like that, you can get a very good CI benefit. And also now there are pathways for biogas to electricity, which is the lowest CI you can get through this program, because as I showed you before, the biogas already earns a pretty low CI. And on top of that, LCFS credits are awarded to infrastructure charging projects. This is meant to kind of fix the chicken and egg problem of getting infrastructure built. And basically, you can earn credits without having anyone charge at your station. If you build it and no one comes, it doesn't matter. And as people start to come and charge more, you start to earn more of the electricity charging credits and less of the infrastructure credits. So it's meant to kind of get you going, get you started, and then as you kind of take off, it tampers off. However, the infrastructure charging credits are limited. You can only, they're capped at 5% of last quarter's deficit. So in any given quarter, you can only generate credits up to that amount. And as I mentioned, this feature is what kind of makes an LCFS not completely technology neutral, but perhaps it's what's needed to get the investments needed to make electric vehicles kind of take off. Now, what I see being the thing to look out for is the relationship between biomass-based diesel and electricity. Electricity, if penetration can be quick and significant, it can significantly lower the amount of biomass-based diesel we'll need to meet the standard. I see this being the most important trade-off that will take place out to 2030. We did a study here where we said under business as usual conditions, how much biomass-based diesel will we need to comply with the policy? And keep in mind, that's because it's the marginal compliance fuel. Most other things can't grow that much. And, you know, we did a scenario where if we met California's goal of getting 5 million EVs by 2035, or by 2030, sorry, then how much would that change the amount of biomass-based diesel needed to comply? And as you can see here, by quite a lot. If things were to, if everything else were to stay as it is right now, we would need almost 80% of, 75% of all diesel fuel to be biomass-based. Whereas if we were to meet that goal, we would need less than 25% of biomass-based diesel. And then to conclude, what's next? I think renewable diesel is the big one. How much of this capacity will come online? There's a lot of pushback from EJ groups and things like that. And the other big thing is, will the feedstock markets keep up? As I showed previously, there's worry that there will be a feedstock deficit. Used cooking oil is kind of hit its limit, according to some folks in the industry. On top of that, there's new policies for sustainable aviation fuel coming online. You may have heard President Biden just recently announced a goal for 3 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030 and all 100% by 2050. And that's a lot of gallons of biomass, or sorry, I should say that sustainable aviation fuel is basically renewable diesel, but for airplanes. It uses the same feedstocks and a lot of the same production processes. So that's going to really put a lot of pressure on this renewable diesel space. And you know, as I showed, there's proposed to have 6 billion gallons of capacity by 2024. Half of that, if it stays at 6 billion gallons out to 2030, half of that would be going to sustainable aviation fuel, and which means less for compliance in the LCFS. The other is electricity, and as I mentioned, you know, how fast will the pace of EV adoption be, and will we have enough clean sources to keep up with this charging? And how much will EVs offset gasoline demand? Because the more EVs we have, the less gasoline we're using and the less deficits that we're generating, which makes it easier to comply with the policy. Then biogas, you know, will these dairy digesters scale? They are by far the biggest earner in the California LCFS. So if they can scale, it would be quite significant value going to them, and it would mean a lot for generating credits. Then the other thing is, will we ever move past the E10 blend wall, or will we have more alternatives besides electricity? There are new pathways for renewable gasoline. Cellulosics have always been kind of a decade away of being commercially scaled, and we kind of never get there. And there's also been a push for E15. The other is carbon capture and sequestration, which is mostly planned to be used in ethanol plants. And so that could dramatically reduce the CI of ethanol, which would mean more compliance coming from the gasoline sector. And then all these other fuel policies that are coming online, driving demand for alternative fuels. How will that interact with these LCFS policies? And lastly, environmental justice. There are local air quality consequences of this. For instance, the one being this renewable diesel build out with using lots of hydrogen, and there's other things that are relatively have been unstudied to date, but I think that's an interesting thing to look out for. And that's it. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to answering some questions and talking.
Thank you very much, Daniel. First, I want everyone to give him a round of applause. That was really informative. I also want to say we've had a great discussion going on in the chat. We probably could talk about this for a very, very long time. I'm going to quickly drop, if you really support what CleanStart's doing, quickly drop our PayPal in there if you want to support us, and also today's slides, which have a link to Daniel's slides if you want to check out more information on them. And I actually want to give the first question to Gary, because I know you've done a lot of thinking around this. Do you have a question for Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, and Daniel, good heavens, a master class of the low carbon fuel standard. We really appreciate that so much. So thank you for doing that this morning. Lots of opportunities I see for innovation here. We talked a little bit in beforehand about synthetic fuels that are made from captured carbon dioxide and green hydrogen. If that carbon dioxide comes from an exhaust stack, a smokestack on a industrial plant, do you think that would get a low carbon intensity score? I can see some issues there, but if the economics continue to improve, and I got to tell you, with the kind of credit numbers that you're quoting here, you could probably make those synthetics economical. What are your thoughts on that?
It's hard to say without knowing some of the specifics of the technology itself, but in general, it's all about what it is relative to gasoline and diesel in the end, right? And it's likely to be a lower carbon footprint than gasoline and diesel, which means it has opportunity for credit generation. How far that's one of the issues with this is it's up to the administrating agency or the these models that they use to determine the carbon intensity, so it's kind of hard to say a lot of times. I see there being a lot of potential. I just don't know how low it can go. But there are several things in the program where you have quite a bit of carbon and you still get a decent amount of value. And that's one of the issues with this policy, or from an economist standpoint, is that we're actually subsidizing emissions as long as they're lower than the standard, right? Which is not as efficient as a carbon tax, but so there's certainly potential. And the issue though is if there is worry that it has not a lot of, or there may be carbon consequences, then you really got to get them done soon, right? Because the standard is decreasing every year, and the longer before it comes online, the less opportunities for credit generation that you have.
Okay, we're gonna only have time for 2 questions. We're gonna go with Mark and then Peter, and just be conscious of time. Mark, you want to ask? You're muted. All right. Well, Peter, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's actually not really a question. It's a couple of comments, but if there's responses, then that's fine. So with the renewable diesel, I guess there's issues beyond the carbon intensity, and that's the fact that it's diesel, right? So it's still spewing out PM10, PM2.5.
Yeah.
And the trucks that use it are probably driving through low income, disadvantaged communities, and so it's not really helping them that much. So I think it's not really a function of the low carbon fuel standard to fix this, but there should be other things done to try to fix the amount of diesel that we use. We should be using less.
Absolutely. And that's a very important piece of this. Especially with all this capacity coming online, that's the majority being soybean oil. It's not the lowest carbon alternative, and that seems to be it's going to be a very significant part of the path that we take. And the LCFS treats emissions coming out of the tailpipe by these biosources as zero, basically, because they're biogenic, even though they are actual emissions.
Right. Okay. Okay. And then a second question / comment. The LCFS for EVs. I think you may have mentioned it and I missed it, but I mean the reason that it's different, and it could still be biased, but the reason it's different is because the utilities are under a separate mandate to purchase carbon-free electricity. So then that carbon-free electricity is then used to charge the EVs, and so that's why the utilities get the credits, not the producers of the carbon-free electricity. And so, I don't know if that's the best way to do it, and I don't know if it's still biased even because of that reason, but I just thought I'd throw that out.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Thank you for that, Carl. We are getting closer to the end on it. On the slides that I shared, if you go to the slide that has Daniel's information, there's a slide link to his slides. So if you click on that, you can get to those through there. I also want to point out that the ARB is very responsive. The local area resources board, they all really take feedback on this very seriously. And if you talk to them, you will hear the concerns about local air pollutions, because a lot of them, that's what their mandate is to fix or to resolve. So make sure that you stay involved with that. Daniel's contact is up here. Connect with him, so that way you know what the research is going on in our local area, and how you can get involved to really make a difference. And if you want to kind of connect with us and more of our events, I'm going to drop links to our upcoming events in the chat here. Also, there's a local company that is addressing this or helping with low carbon fuel standard right now. I'm going to put them in the link there too. They've come on and chatted with us. And then I'm going to go and try to wrap things up. Mark, do you have a quick question, or because we try to get, we're running low on time?
Yeah, the quick question is whether Daniel would be interested in modeling the electricity thing using my inputs in terms of cost, and because I'm trying to find out how much value we could get for the battery and solar thin film products we can make from this mechanism per kilowatt hour, so I can do cost comparisons and use that as part of the sales process.
That sounds like a great thing to follow up with him
Yeah.
on.
An email about it. Yeah.
And economists do love models.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Yes. And so I want to give another thank you to Daniel for coming on and letting us talk with him and sharing with us all the stuff that's happening with the low carbon fuel standard. I also want to thank everyone that participated in this. I think there were some great discussions in the chat there, from trees to impacts to being realistic about whether this is the best solution. I also want to thank our supporters, including you guys out there. Thank you for attending. Make sure you check out our next perspective on the UC Davis ecosystem on entrepreneurship and virtual power plants and the grid on the 30th. Additional thanks to our overall sponsors, Hacker Lab, that's where I'm hiding at right now, Momentum, which actually helped create emission controls, Reverent, and GT Law. And with that, thank you everyone for attending, and a round of applause, and hope to see you all in the future.